What we need to have done better, I think, is the extent of that guarantee, whether it should have covered all classes of debtors, whether it should have covered all institutions or all institutions in a particular way. But we only know that in retrospect. And if you remember at the time the guarantee being put in place, there was an initial reaction, particularly from the United Kingdom, censuring Ireland for doing this action at the time. And within a matter of days, the response across Europe was to adopt similar guarantees in their own countries.
Well, they had no alternative because we had precipitated the whole thing. Christine Lagarde, the French finance minister, was furious with Brian Lenihan that time.
Of course, the initial reaction was negative, but if you look at how the responses have been looked at as a totality, how the Irish government has dealt with the crises, both in terms of public expenditure and the banking situation, it has been endorsed by the IMF, it has been endorsed by the OECD, it has been endorsed by the European Commission and the European Central Bank. The problems we're dealing with now is dealing with the consequences of making that decision with the information we've learned subsequently.
Frank Fahey, what's your reaction to these documents?
Well, I think Michael Noonan's point there, in fact, he's proving in what he's saying that the government did the right thing. Thank God they didn't accept the advice of Merrill Lynch. And, Merrill Lynch put forward a number of options with a number of pros and cons. They didn't endorse a particular approach. And it's just as well that the government didn't actually follow that advice. And proof of the fact that the type of guarantee which was given is correct is that throughout September and October, governments throughout the EU issued similar types of guarantee. And Patrick Honohan, when he came into our Finance Committee and in his banking report, endorsed the government's approach to issuing a broad guarantee, and he even spells out the catastrophic consequences if the government had taken action. He said banks would have failed within days if it was a thing that the government didn't do.
Frank Fahey, there's a fundamental issue here. Did the government get proper advice or good advice, and do they have good information to go on at the time? Now, just to explain to our listeners, liquidity means whether you have enough cash to continue in existence or not. Solvency is whether or not your assets and your liabilities, or your assets exceed your liabilities. This government, Frank Fahey, it seemed to see the whole thing in terms of short-term liquidity. Presumably,
you know better than most, and indeed the documents convey, and I haven't read them, but they convey how quickly the international financial system was changing with daily updates on new international banks in difficulties and so on. So, the difference between liquidity and solvency could change overnight. And there is no doubt now, and I think these documents will show, that the government did the right thing, that the advice certainly from the regulator and others was not very right. But in regard to Anglo, the point that Michael Noonan makes again proves how wrong Fine Gael have got it. If Anglo had been allowed to fail, the cost to the taxpayer at that point would have been at the order of 60 billion. We were informed in the Finance Committee about a month ago that even at this stage, if Anglo were allowed to fail, the cost to the taxpayer would be of the order of 42 billion. So it's about time for Fine Gael to stop the myth that, it would save the taxpayer of this country, either now or indeed back in September, on the 25th of September.
I want to bring...
That's a load of nonsense.
Michael Noonan, maybe you could answer that, and I want to ask you about the whole attitude of government at the time.
I suppose the first question is if the government on the night were prepared to ignore the advice of Merrill Lynch that they had retained to advise them, and they were prepared to ignore the advice of David Doyle, who was Secretary General in the Department of Finance. Whose advice did they actually follow when they brought in the guarantee that they brought in, and when they decided to rescue Anglo-Irish? Now, secondly, on the issue about the potential liability if they hadn't guaranteed Anglo-Irish. Anglo-Irish Bank was a private bank, underpinned by private shareholders, and they had borrowed in the market. There was no state involvement in it whatsoever. It was only on the 15th of January 2009, when the government decided to nationalise it, that the state took liability for the debts of Anglo-Irish Bank.
Michael, I just want to ask you, I can ask you a question about that. There's an actual chart in these documents, among the 50 documents. There's a chart of options that are facing the government and facing the Department of Finance at this critical week in our financial history. And each side of the chart, it says, options regarding Anglo-Irish Bank, pump in more liquidity, pump in more liquidity, pump in more liquidity. They didn't even conceive the possibility that Anglo might be losing billions and billions of euros.
No, you'll appreciate I haven't seen all the documents yet, but I accept what you're saying. But at the same time, you had the Secretary General and the Department of Finance warning that there was a black hole emerging of $8.5 billion, and you had their advisors Merrill Lynch saying, turn it into a bad bank and dump the toxic assets of the other banks into it and wind it down. I mean, these are the advices in front of them. So why did they go down the road where between Anglo-Irish Bank now and Irish Nationwide, the taxpayer is divvying up somewhere around $25 billion, and according to the Taoiseach, we have no hope of ever seeing any of it again?
Dan Boyle?
Well, again, this is all coming down in retrospect. I believe that the bank guarantee scheme was the right decision to be made. I think there are flaws in the making of the decision, that we're paying more than we need to. But you have to bear in mind, Damien, that whatever course of action was taken at the time, because Anglo-Irish was a licensed bank and because it was a badly regulated bank by the Irish state, or an office of the Irish state, we still would have been liable for billions upon billions in a subsequent cost. And if we took the immediate wind down road, which was proposed from day one, that would have meant that dozens of billions of deposit holders would have had to been immediately repaid. We would have had to borrow that money up front. We would have had to borrow that money at an enormous additional cost. If you look at the difference between ourselves and Greece in borrowing money, that would have cost far more money again.
Okay, so, Dan, I want to refer to a document that has been supplied here by the department. It's dated the 22nd of September 2008. It's an option document relating to Irish Nationwide. It says basically Irish Nationwide is on the point of collapse. So this supports what Michael Noonan was saying. It says it refers explicitly to the likely collapse of Irish Nationwide. It says this will cause a severe outflow of capital from Ireland.